photographs of mine. There's nothing worse than seeing somebody's old photographs. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, we'll see how we get through. Alright, welcome everybody. So what we're going to be doing today, what we're going to be looking at today is how the Cold War develops into the 1960s and essentially the build up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, alright, and which we'll probably start doing next lesson. Alright, in order to be able to do that, first of all we need to look at the two new personalities that are in the lead in the United States and in the Soviet Union. Remember, we've looked at Stalin and Truman, and now it's really time to look at Kennedy and Khrushchev, the two Ks. Fortunately, there's not a third K. Alright, otherwise it would be the KKK, that would be really bad. Although Kennedy's kind of trying to deal with that in America as well. Alright, not like Woodrow Wilson, your fine man who was a member of the KKK and was a horrible racist. The one that everybody says in history, oh yeah, he's really good at the Treaty of Versailles. No, I hate Woodrow Wilson more than I hate any other person I ever teach. He's a horrible man. Speaking of horrible men, John F. Kennedy. Alright, he was elected president in 1960. Alright, narrowly, very controversially, he defeated the sitting Vice President Richard Nixon. Alright, based on some dodgy shenanigans in two states, in Illinois and in Texas, particularly in Illinois. Mayor Daley, who was the mayor of Chicago, found lots of votes. Richard Nixon carries this through as though he's been sort of like cheated. This will add, when we look at Nixon in the 1970s, this will be part of his ongoing personal tragedy as he delves into personal self-loathing and loathing of the world with his. And I think this is the time he starts his naughty list, where he starts literally writing down the names of people that he wants to get back at. But Kennedy's big campaigns was that Nixon was soft on the fence, that the United States had fallen behind the Soviet Union, and a missile gap had opened up. Alright, this was because the Soviet Union had a big advantage in space technology. Their rocketry was much superior to the Americans. The first satellite, Sputnik, the first person in space, Yuri Gagarin. However, this was sort of like a little bit of nonsense. Alright, some people, the CIA, they start this process of pretty much all of their intelligence about the Soviet Union being completely wrong, as we'll see in 1989 particularly. So we've got different types of missiles, the big one, and here we also have a change. Alright, missiles take over, technology of missiles take over. So this is why we have a missile race, an arms race. And the key ones are kind of like what's called ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So cool because they can travel around the world, hit anywhere around the world. Alright. So they reckon the Soviet Union might have as many as 1,500. The USA had 130. In reality, the Soviets had 4, if you include prototypes. Right, so this is the background of what we're going to do. And you can kind of like, let's see if you can guess what's one of the reactions of the Soviet Union to the Cuban Missile Crisis. What do they do afterwards? Make lots of nuclear weapons. Alright, so that's one of the consequences. But what Kennedy has to do, he has to be seen as being tough on communism. Alright, he's seen as a young man, maybe some quite naive. He's a Democrat, a progressive, so obviously on the left, therefore seen as being maybe a potential communist. So he has to sort of like double himself down as so that he's tough on communism. Alright? He's going to face two threats: Berlin crisis and in Cuba. But before we look at those, we're going to look at his kind of a opposite number, which is Nikita Khrushchev, he of the tomatoes that we talked about and the kick me in the back. There he is, Nikita Khrushchev. Alright, he basically becomes supreme leader in 1956. After the death of Stalin, there's a troika, a leadership of three: Malenkov and some Molotov, I think I might have got that wrong, don't quote me on that. But anyway, he becomes basically the leader in 1956. And when he becomes the leader in 1956, after this power struggle, a little bit talk about him first. As a person, He's quite emotional, he's quite unpredictable. He was a massive true believer in communism. He said by 1980 the Soviet Union is going to overtake America. Alright, he was a peasant, he had no formal education. He was determined to be accepted. So he comes from a very, very poor background, works his way up. He has this kind of idea that he has to prove himself to all of these different people because he's worked his way up from the villages. In the Second World War, he was one of the leaders that Stalin sent to the front lines. So he was during the Battle of Stalingrad. He was there. Lots of all through the Ukraine. Because he was Ukraine Party boss. He was there. He'd seen the worst of World War II, which made him determined to avoid war. But he also dealt with things with a lot of like peasant bluff and bluster and all of that type of things. He's a very different character. His tombstone in Moscow has one side white, one side black, to kind of like show his two sides of his character. Alright? It's a very interesting man actually. At this stage, the United States had overwhelming superiority in air power and in nuclear weapons. Khrushchev was determined that he had to deal with this. Communism had to win, and he's going to deal with that. So how is Khrushchev going to deal with this? He comes up with three main policies. The first one is de-Stalinization. Right, he says we have to get rid of Stalin. He blames Stalin. He does a speech once he's got power on the 25th of February 1956, the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Behind closed doors, he makes a speech. So it's known as the secret speech. All right, and his secret speech is of profound importance to the communist world. He said Stalin took things too far. Stalin had a massive cult of personality. He was about himself rather than he was about communism, and that he murdered and massacred lots of people. Stalin was a bad man. Wow. He therefore seeks to reform communism in the Soviet Union. When we go to the 1980s and we look at Mikhail Gorbachev, really Khrushchev is a precursor to that. He seeks to liberalize communism, right? Because he's a great believer in communism, and he thinks, well, if we're true to ourselves, everybody will want to be communist. He liberalizes. This will cause the beginning of a split within the communist movement, particularly between the Soviet Union and China, because what he's just described there, a mass murderer who's got a massive cult of personality leading the country, is exactly what Mao Zedong is in China. Mao Zedong in China doesn't like this. That's why he starts, as I told you, the story with his Speedos. Alright, this starts the Sino-Soviet split, the split between the Soviet Union and China, which will actually lead to them fighting each other in the 1970s. Alright? But what this will mean is that there will be a battle within the communist world that starts here and then will split right up until into the 1960s. There will be a kind of civil war within the communist world between the Soviet Union and China. That will be significant in Vietnam, and it will be significant for Kissinger's policies and Richard Nixon's policies. All right. Secondly, he talks about peaceful coexistence. He says, hey, communism's superior to capitalism. He's a true believer. So we don't need to fight capitalism. We can peacefully coexist because I'm better. We're better than you are. And everybody's going to see that. So why waste time in conflict when we can peacefully coexist? Again, the Chinese communists, the Maoists, don't like this. They're like, we want confrontation. Oh, Khrushchev, we don't like you very much. We don't like what you're saying. We should have much more war. However, in a kind of as an opposite to this peaceful coexistence, He supports national liberation movements. Now we're obsessed with the Cold War and we're talking about the Cold War, but actually, in terms of history, the biggest historical change taking place at this time is the decolonization of European empires, both in Asia and in Africa. Okay, so Khrushchev sees this as, it's clear what the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan called a wind of change blowing across Africa, leading to the independence of countries in Africa from European colonial powers. This wind of change. Behind this wind of change, the communists can grow and they can support national liberation movements. So basically, if you wanted to become a power after the European colonists have left, you could either become a friend of America. If they said no, you could become a friend of the Soviet Union. And so we have a kind of lots of dictators taking their place on both sides across Africa, Latin America, and across in Asia. This really means that the Third World War. So these newly decolonized countries will become the epicenter of the Cold War, which is why we have conflicts in Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and across Africa. All right. It's also a bit of a contradiction between peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence, yeah, in Northern Europe, in the north and in Europe. Elsewhere, no, we're going to have proxy conflict. Remember the word proxy? All right, so use that word, proxy. One thing that may come up, this might be a paper 1 question, might be a paper 2 question. He gets tested first in Hungary. All right, he gets tested first in Hungary. So he starts, let's liberating everybody. Let's liberate. Let's be more liberal. Communism's all good. This is going to be great. All right. Stalin used force, therefore he's a bad person. All right. So this liberalization is first tested in Hungary, where one of the communist leaders called Imre Nagy, he comes to power and starts introducing reforms. He said, I'm going to follow what Khrushchev says, yeah? Khrushchev's saying we should reform communism. Let's do some reformation. So, I don't know, one thing we could reform is, why doesn't Hungary leave the Warsaw Pact and declare neutrality? Oh, no. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. Khrushchev can't allow this. And so the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries invade Hungary. Their tanks enter Budapest, they kill thousands of Hungarians. There's basically a war. They invade and they occupy Hungary in 1956, and they establish a new government. Alright? This is classic Khrushchev. Right? I'm going to say something, we're going to do this, it's going to be amazing. Oh, it's all got wrong. No. Alright, this is classic Khrushchev. This happens in everything that he does. He's like, I've got a great plan, we're going to do this, we're going to liberalise Hungary. I've got a great plan, let's send missiles to Cuba, it's going to be fine. Nearly World War III. In his domestic policy, he decides, which is outside the scope of this because we do foreign affairs, his classic one is what's called the Virgin Lands Programme. He's like, right, we need to have more crops in Russia, in the Soviet Union, to grow our economy. We need to have that. I know, we'll go to virgin lands that's been untouched, that's not been farmed, it's going to be fine, and we're going to grow lots of crops there, and we'll be magnificently rich. But there's a reason why they're virgin lands, because crops don't grow very well there. If they were really cultivatable and you could have had farming, they would have been farms there for millennia. They weren't, so it all crashes. This is classic Khrushchev, all right? He goes way too far and then has to come back. It shows that he would not let countries leave the Soviet sphere of influence. Opposition to Khrushchev starts growing in the Soviet Union. It's already there because people who were fans of Stalin are like, I don't like you criticising the boss, I don't like that. Opposition is like, this guy's a little bit unpredictable. It also shows that the United States policies has changed. Is it too cold, Cider? Is it too cold? Okay. It also shows that policies have changed. The United States maybe has learned their lesson from Korea, because they could have rolled back. They could have helped the Hungarians against the communists, against Russia and the Warsaw Pact. They don't. All right. It basically says, right, containment is confirmed in Europe. This is your area. You can murder, invade other countries as you like. We're not going to get involved. All right. The second event for Khrushchev is the 1956 Suez Crisis. This is like the last gasp of European empires. So Egypt had been a British colony since the 1800s, kind of, and Britain and France had built the Suez Canal. In the news now because you see the Red Sea and the Houthis attacked that area. All right, so this is one of the reasons why European colonial powers used to control that area, one of the main arteries to Asia from Europe. Suez Canal was built by British and American companies. The British had lots of series of bases there after they left Egypt, and in 1953 they left for good. The president of Egypt is a guy called General Nasser, all right, and he starts leading a pro-Arab movement. Very different to what we see today in the Arab Islamic world, because this is secular. This is based on the Ba'ath Party, which is about a secular Arabic states. All right, and so he seeks to unite Arabs. So he does that with Syria and with Yemen and Egypt, the United Arab Republic. After this, he becomes a great hero, but it's secular. It's not religious. It's not religious. And actually, you look at pictures of Cairo under Nasser. There's no burqas, there's no hijabs, stuff like that. It's much more of a secular Islamic country. But what he does in 1956 is he nationalises the Suez Canal. So he basically takes it over from Britain and France. Britain and France like, we don't like this. We need to conduct a plan. And so Britain and France decide they're going to go back 200 years when Britain and France ruled the world. And so they meet with the Israelis in the Mediterranean in secret, and they come up with a plan, a cunning plan, all right? And their cunning plan is this: Israel, why don't you invade Egypt? Right? Israel wants to invade Egypt. They don't want the Arabs getting together and being able to attack Egypt. So Israel's like, yeah, okay, we can invade Egypt. What we'll do then is Britain and France will invade Egypt to secure the Suez Canal, to make sure it's looked after by the international community. We're there as like the referee, all right, because we can't block the Suez Canal. That would be really bad. So Israel, you invade on this day, and then in a week's time we'll invade and pretend we're kind of like keeping both sides apart, but then we'll get rid of the Nasser and we'll be in control of the Suez Canal. Very naughty. Very naughty. But they do this without consulting the Americans. This really annoys Eisenhower because he thinks, the European colonial powers, by doing this is going to help Russia, because the Arab world is going to see through this, and the Arab world is going to say, well, no, if we can't trust the West, we're going to go to the Soviet Union side. And he's like, think of all the oil. That would be very bad. So he then doesn't support Britain and France, which forces Britain and France to withdraw from the Suez Canal, and is essentially, this is the end of the European empires. All right, they can't. It shows that Britain and France can't act without the United States support. All right, so Nasser becomes this great leader in the developing world, and particularly in the Arab world. However, while this was all going on, Khrushchev goes, they need to stop Britain and France, otherwise I'm going to nuke them. I'm going to give Egypt nuclear weapons, and that will stop them. All right. And so when a few days later Britain and France withdraws, he thinks it's down to him because he doesn't know what's happened with the Americans. Right? Because he sees the capitalist world as all one. So he's like, oh wow, I know what I can do. If I bluff with nuclear weapons, I'm going to win. All right, and so remember yesterday when we looked at our game of chicken, right? This means that he really wants to play chicken because he thinks he can win. So now we've got both sides who think they can win a game of chicken. This is bad. All right, look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's the background to the Cuban Missile Crisis. What you kind of need to know for your exam questions that will come up is what the Cuban Missile Crisis was, why Khrushchev put nuclear missiles in Cuba. That's our first one, all right? So this is what the Cuban Missile Crisis was. All right, this is my definition of it: a period of 13 days. Hence the movie 13 Days. That's quite a good movie to watch about the Cuban Missile Crisis from a very pro JFK. Kennedy's amazing. What a wonderful guy he is. He's just great, and he basically saves the world. If you don't mind, is it Richard? It's not Richard Gere. Who is it who plays the name? I can't remember the actor. But yeah. But it gives you an idea of what goes on if you don't mind the fact that it's all like Kennedy's great, yay. So it's from the 15th of October 1962 to 28th of October, those 13 days, when the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The crisis began. Those U-2 spy planes that we talked about yesterday flying over the Soviet Union with getting shot down. Well, one of these fly planes is flying over Cuba, and it reveals, the photographs come back, and it reveals that the Soviet Union are building putting nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba. Now, clearly we've seen, because they don't have ICBMs, they can't reach the United States from Eastern Europe or from the Soviet Union. Well, if we've got our short-range missiles, we can move these intermediate-range missiles. We move those to Cuba. When we can strike America, this is going to balance the power. Okay. We then have a standoff between the USA, who wants the missiles removed and are prepared to invade Cuba to achieve this, and the Soviet Union, who wants to keep them in Cuba and defend Cuban independence. All right. This is seen as being a great thing that, in the orthodox approach, in the kind of accepted narrative of history, this is a great achievement of John F. Kennedy, what he does. This is why he's kind of like up there with the best presidents and statesmen in world history. Arguably, and he wins this in the words that they use later. We went eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy blinked first. All right. Actually, that's not really the case. Actually, if you look at what happens, it's probably Khrushchev who gets most out of this. But what Khrushchev gets is kept secret, which will then lead to his overthrow.
Is the 13 days one of the actors, Kevin Costner?
Kevin Costner's the dude, yes, that's the fella. It's basically Kevin Costner plays Kennedy, and Kevin Costner's... No, he doesn't. Kevin Costner plays the advisor to Kennedy, who basically tells everybody how amazing Kennedy is and how great he is. All right? Some background. All right, some backgrounds. We've got the missiles. Basically, you've got 3 different types of missiles. This is just for your background until you know. All right, these missiles are classified on how far they can travel. Your intercontinental ones, ICBMs, they can go anywhere around the world. Your medium range ones, they can only go a few hundred miles. All right, so Soviet Union's got very few ICBMs, if any, but they've got a few medium range ones. The United States has lots of both. So if the Soviet Union moves the medium range ones to Cuba, they can hit America like America can hit them. So it evens out the balance of power. There's also tactical nuclear weapons, which seems kind of like strange. But if you're on a battlefield, all right, and you're losing, then you can have an artillery shell, or you can have a very short-range missile that's like a nuclear bomb. All right, that's like Hiroshima. So if you've got lots of the Americans, let's say an invasion force is coming, landing the beaches, you've only got a couple of people there, you can launch a tactical nuclear weapon. All right. What's important about this? There's 2 things that's important about this. One, the command authority for the use of those is by a very junior ranking officer. So a lieutenant, a captain, not a president, not a general, but these can be authorized by quite somebody of relatively low rank. It's a bit scary. Number 2, the Soviet Union, in order to defend their missile sites, have got these tactical missiles called Frog missiles. The United States doesn't know this. So if the United States invades Cuba, which they are planning to do, some lieutenant in the Soviet army could launch a nuclear weapon on the US Marines, and they go up in a big mushroom cloud. This will not go down well in America. All right, so the danger is greater than it appears on the surface. All right. Kennedy, I've already talked about. he comes in and is determined not to be seen as being soft on communism. So he launches. So there's a plan. Remember when we talked about Eisenhower, he used a lot of covert action by the CIA to overthrow people that the United States didn't like. All right, and we showed that in Iran when they overthrew the government there with MI6. We saw that in Congo where Patrice Lubamba was shot, was murdered. So, and we saw that in Guatemala where the Allende regime was overthrown. So this has worked so far. Let's do it in Cuba. All right. So in 1959. Cuba's under a dictatorship by a right-wing dictatorship, fascist dictatorship, military dictatorship, and a guy called Batista. This is overthrown by a group of communists led by Fidel Castro, La Bombarderos, the bearded ones, because they all have big beards. All right, Fidel Castro is a very charismatic figure. By his side is an Argentine called Che Guevara, Ernesto Che Guevara. Che is Spanish for mate, friend. All right, mate. All right, mate. So he's always like Che. So they call him Che. He's a doctor. He's an Argentine doctor to show the international nature of communist movement within Cuba. He travels around Latin America on a motorcycle with his friend. It's called The Motorcycle Diaries. It's a very interesting autobiography book. And from that he sees the inequality within Latin America and decides to dedicate himself to communism. And so he joins up with Fidel Castro and they launch a revolution which is successful in 1959. All right. So how are the Americans going to react to this? Well, what they're going to try and do is what they've done in the Third World previously. Particularly when he starts nationalising industries, they decide that they are going to sponsor an invasion. All right? So, this is what the Bay of Pigs invasion is. All right? In May 1960, a group of Cuban exiles, refugees based in Mexico and based in Florida, they say, yes, give us support, and the CIA give them weapons, give them air support, give all kinds of support. They actually bomb. These exiles fly planes over Cuba and bomb Cuba. All right. They say, and the Americans believe, because remember they're very anti-communist. How could anybody support communism? And so they believe once they land in Cuba, even though there's only 1,500 of them, then the rest of the Cuban population will go, "Yay! The American-backed supporters have returned. The people who oppressed us for 100 years are back. This is great news. We're going to support them." Unsurprisingly, that doesn't happen. All right, and the Bay of Pigs is a massive humiliation. All right, Castro's troops defeat them. So, consequences. Clearly, the United States is trying to do everything it can do to get rid of the communist government in Cuba. Later on, because they will try and do other things as well. So, for example, Fidel Castro. What does Fidel Castro like to do? Any ideas? Can you remember? Have you seen Fidel Castro? Probably not. Smoke cigars. Cuba's famous for cigars, right? So what's one way to kill Castro? Poisoned or exploding cigars. So the CIA tried to get some exploding cigars close to him. They think because he's this big powerful figure, they're known as the bearded ones. I know, we'll put something in his cigars or in his food that will make his hair fall out. So he'll look ridiculous and nobody will support the communists. And they tried many different ways in which to kill Castro. None of them work. Alright? So it's clear that the United States is trying to overthrow the Cuban government. Right? Therefore, and through invasion. So therefore, the Soviet Union wants to show itself, we've got this new spreading support for national liberation movements. Here's a great one in Cuba. We should have to support it. This is a test case for us. So Khrushchev's question is, how can I support Cuba when the United States wants to intervene? Within the United States, there's a number of consequences too. Number one is the military establishment are like, "Oh, it's your fault, Kennedy. You should have given them more support. You should have bombed them. You should have sent in the U.S. Air Force. You should have given it. Oh, you can't trust the Kennedys." So there's a split. The other side, from the Kennedys camp, and John F. Kennedy's biggest advisor is his brother, Robert Kennedy. All right. They think, oh, grrr, the establishment, the military organisation, what Eisenhower called just before he left office the military-industrial complex, they're all against us as well. This was a stitch-up. We should have listened to ourselves, and we realised this was a bad idea. So within the US government, we kind of have a split between the pro-Kennedy and the anti-Kennedy forces. For the Soviet Union, Khrushchev now has this two questions that he wants to be able to do. One is he wants to be able to defend Cuba. Secondly, he wants to be able to balance the nuclear missiles. Suddenly, these two things come into view. Suddenly, on one night, he has this idea: I know how I can defend Cuba, and at the same time, change the balance of power in favour of the Soviet Union. If I put nuclear missiles in Cuba, Cuba will be defended because the United States won't dare attack, and finally the balance will be made. I will have a balance of power. So here we can see why Khrushchev takes those actions. Alright? Any questions about that? No?